Fort Ord, California, July 1958. The military dentist's hands trembled as he extracted the seventh tooth from Lieutenant Paul Whipkey's mouth, each one crumbling like charcoal despite the young officer being only 26 years old. Something had happened to Paul in the Nevada desert, something that made his superiors schedule meetings behind closed doors and his fellow soldiers avoid eye contact in the hallways. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale of the price some soldiers pay for witnessing what they were never meant to see. Paul Whipkey stared at his reflection in the base infirmary mirror, counting the black moles that had erupted across his neck like malignant constellations. 12 yesterday, 14 today. The base physician claimed they were benign pigmentation changes caused by desert sun exposure, but Paul knew better. He'd tasted the metallic poison coating his throat since returning from Camp Desert Rock, felt his fingernails loosening in their beds, watched his hair fall out in clumps that clogged the barracks' shower drains. The atomic testing program had done this to him. The observation flights through radioactive clouds, the contaminated equipment, the casual exposure to doses that military scientists insisted were within acceptable parameters. But Paul wasn't just sick. He was evidence of criminal negligence that could destroy careers and expose state secrets worth killing to protect. That's when the interviews began. Men in unremarkable gray suits appeared without warning, requesting private consultations that left Paul's uniform soaked in cold sweat. They carried government identification, but never specified which agency employed them. Their questions focused obsessively on Paul's Nevada observations. What equipment had he seen that wasn't in official reports? Which personnel had accessed restricted areas without proper authorization? Had he noticed any foreign nationals among the civilian contractors? "You seem to be experiencing some discomfort, Lieutenant," the lead interrogator observed during Paul's third session. "Physical symptoms can affect memory reliability. We're here to help you remember correctly." The man's smile never reached his eyes as he leaned forward with predatory interest. "Tell us again about the biological sampling equipment you observed near Ground Zero, the devices that weren't in your official mission briefing." Paul's blood turned to ice water. He'd never reported seeing unauthorized sampling equipment. The knowledge existed only in his memory, yet these men knew details he'd never shared with anyone. They were reading his thoughts, or they'd been watching him far longer than he'd realized. "I don't know what you're talking about," Paul lied, watching both interrogators exchange meaningful glances. "Memory fragmentation is common after radiation exposure," the second man said, his voice carrying casual menace. "Sometimes recollections surface gradually. We'll schedule additional sessions to help you recover complete details." Paul left that meeting with the growing certainty that he'd witnessed something in Nevada worth murdering American soldiers to conceal. The men in gray suits weren't conducting debriefings. They were determining whether he represented an acceptable security risk or required permanent elimination. As he walked back to his quarters, Paul noticed the dark sedan following at a careful distance, its occupants maintaining visual surveillance with professional patience. The hunting party had selected their target. Now they were simply deciding when to pull the trigger. Paul's new dentures clicked against each other as he attempted to swallow the breakfast that tasted like copper pennies and decay. Across the mess hall, 3 other Nevada veterans sat in isolation, their meals untouched, black lesions visible on their exposed skin. Nobody spoke about the shared symptoms, the unspoken rule that acknowledging the contamination might accelerate whatever elimination process had already begun. Private First Class Rodriguez had developed a persistent cough that produced bloody sputum. Sergeant Williams couldn't keep food down. his digestive system apparently dissolving from radiation exposure. Corporal Chen's hair had fallen out completely, leaving his scalp covered in weeping sores that refused to heal despite repeated medical treatment. They were all dying slowly, and they all knew it. The fourth interview took place in Building 47's basement level, a concrete chamber Paul hadn't known existed. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sickly illumination on bare walls that seemed designed for easy cleaning after messy procedures. The familiar gray-suited men waited behind a steel table, but today they weren't alone. A figure in a white laboratory coat stood near medical equipment that had no business existing in a military interrogation facility. IV stands, restraint devices, surgical instruments arranged with clinical precision. Paul's stomach lurched as he recognized the setup. This wasn't debriefing anymore. This was preparation for involuntary medical procedures. Lieutenant Whipkey, we need to discuss what you observed during Test Shot Umbrella, the lead interrogator began, consulting files that contained photographs Paul had never seen before. Images of himself taken during Nevada operations, close-ups showing him examining equipment that wasn't supposed to exist. You spent considerable time near the biological sampling station on July 15th. The equipment operated by our international partners. What exactly did you witness? Paul's throat constricted as suppressed memories crashed back with terrifying clarity. Foreign technicians in contamination suits collecting tissue samples from test animals, speaking languages that definitely weren't Russian or Chinese. Sophisticated monitoring devices recording biological data that had nothing to do with weapons testing. Refrigerated containers marked with symbols he'd never seen in any military manual. I followed standard observation protocols, Paul whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of accumulated fear. Mr. Chen disagrees with your assessment. The interrogator gestured toward the medical technician. He believes your memory requires chemical assistance to achieve complete accuracy. The man in the white coat approached with a syringe containing amber fluid that caught the fluorescent light like liquid fire. Paul recognized sodium pentothal from medical training, truth serum that would strip away every mental defense, every carefully constructed lie, every protective barrier between his knowledge and their extraction procedures. This will help you remember details that conscious resistance has suppressed, Chen explained in accented English that confirmed Paul's worst suspicions. International cooperation requires complete information sharing about biological contamination protocols. Paul realized with crystalline horror that the atomic testing program had been cover for something far more sinister. Foreign nationals had used American soldiers as unwitting test subjects for biological weapons research, collecting contamination data that would inform future attacks against U.S. forces. The Nevada veterans weren't just radiation victims. They were experimental subjects whose survival threatened to expose collaborative genocide. Please extend your arm, Lieutenant. Cooperation will minimize discomfort during the extraction process. Paul understood the euphemism. They would drain every secret from his dying brain, then dispose of his body where it would never be found. The other Nevada veterans would follow shortly, eliminated one by one as their usefulness expired and their knowledge became liability. As the needle approached his skin, Paul made a decision that would either save his life or accelerate his death. He would attempt escape during transfer to whatever disposal facility they'd prepared for him. The game of hunter and prey was about to begin in earnest. Paul jerked his arm away from the needle just as footsteps echoed in the corridor above. The interruption saved him from immediate chemical interrogation, but the reprieve felt temporary, like a condemned man receiving a phone call minutes before execution. The foreign technician stepped back with professional disappointment while the interrogators exchanged frustrated glances. We'll continue this session tomorrow, Lieutenant. Rest well tonight. The dismissal carried unmistakable threat. They would complete the extraction procedure regardless of his cooperation, but they preferred willing compliance to reduce complications during disposal. Paul returned to his quarters with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, only to discover that his world had contracted into something resembling solitary confinement. Sergeant Martinez, who'd shared countless conversations about baseball and weekend plans, now crossed streets to avoid contact. Captain Torres issued orders through intermediaries rather than speak directly. Even Father McKinnon, the base chaplain, suddenly became unavailable whenever Paul requested confession. The isolation felt orchestrated with surgical precision. Someone had activated a protocol designed to sever every social connection that might notice when Lieutenant Paul Whipkey disappeared permanently. His fellow officers weren't avoiding him from personal choice. They'd received instructions that made friendship with Paul Whipkey a career-ending decision. During evening chow, Paul sat alone at tables that emptied whenever he approached. Conversations died mid-sentence when he entered rooms. Soldiers who'd known him for months suddenly developed urgent business elsewhere whenever he appeared. The psychological warfare was brutally effective, making him question his own sanity while preparing witnesses for his eventual absence. But the most chilling discovery came when Paul attempted to call his brother Carl from the base payphone. The operator informed him that all outgoing calls required authorization from his commanding officer. When Paul requested the necessary paperwork, he was told that Lieutenant Whipkey's communication privileges had been suspended pending completion of his security review. They'd cut him off from the outside world completely. That night, Paul noticed light bleeding beneath his bathroom door. Not the warm glow of incandescent bulbs, but the harsh white illumination of surgical equipment. When he investigated, he found medical technicians installing monitoring devices disguised as routine maintenance, cameras concealed in light fixtures, audio recording equipment hidden behind ventilation grates, motion sensors that would track his every movement within the supposedly private quarters. They were studying him like a laboratory specimen, documenting his behavior patterns before final termination. The realization struck with paralyzing force. He'd become a test subject in experiments that extended far beyond Nevada's atomic program. Foreign researchers were using American soldiers to perfect elimination techniques that could be deployed against enemy personnel in future conflicts. Paul's medical records had probably been shared with hostile intelligence services, his physical deterioration analyzed to improve biological weapons designed specifically to target U.S. military forces. His death would provide valuable data about radiation poisoning progression, psychological breakdown timelines, and the effectiveness of isolation protocols in preventing security breaches. The next morning brought worse news delivered through official channels that made resistance impossible. Paul received orders for immediate reassignment to specialized duties requiring enhanced security clearance. The paperwork authorized his transfer to an undisclosed location where he would undergo extended debriefing procedures lasting indefinitely. Translation: they were moving him to a black site facility where his screams wouldn't disturb base operations and his body could be disposed of without witnesses. The transfer would occur in 72 hours, providing just enough time for final preparations and elimination of any remaining evidence connecting Paul Whipkey to classified Nevada operations. As Paul read the orders that amounted to his death warrant, he realized escape represented his only chance for survival. But fleeing would require careful planning, precise timing, and acceptance that he would be hunted by professionals who specialized in tracking down soldiers who knew too much. The countdown to his execution had officially begun. Paul's fingernails had begun separating from their beds, leaving bloody crescents whenever he gripped objects too tightly. The radiation poisoning was accelerating, his body consuming itself from within, while his executioners refined their disposal timeline. 72 hours remained before transfer to the Black Site facility. But Paul suspected they would move earlier if his physical condition deteriorated beyond useful parameters. That's when Private First Class Thompson appeared outside the motor pool maintenance shed, glancing nervously around before approaching with information that changed everything. "Sir, I know what you saw in Nevada," Thompson whispered, his young face etched with terror that matched Paul's own. "The foreign technicians, the biological sampling equipment, the tissue collection procedures. I was there too, assigned to equipment maintenance for Test Shot Umbrella." Paul's heart hammered against his ribs as Thompson described witnessing unauthorized personnel harvesting contaminated biological samples from test animals and exposed vegetation. The foreign researchers had collected extensive data about radiation effects on living tissue, information that could be used to weaponize atomic contamination against enemy populations. "They made us sign additional security oaths," Thompson continued, producing documents from his jacket pocket, "special non-disclosure agreements that threatened our families if we ever discussed what we'd observed. My sister lives in San Francisco with her 2 kids. They know her address, her work schedule, her children's school." Paul examined the paperwork with growing horror. The security oaths contained language that went far beyond standard military confidentiality requirements, including explicit authorization for protective measures against family members who might be contacted by personnel attempting to breach operational security. "Thompson, you need to request immediate transfer. Get away from Fort Ord before they decide you're a liability." "Already tried, sir. Transfer denied. Medical evaluation required first. They've scheduled me for psychological assessment next week. Same building where you've been having your interviews." The pattern crystallized with sickening clarity. They were systematically processing Nevada veterans through evaluation procedures designed to identify security risks and eliminate witnesses to the biological weapons collaboration. Thompson would undergo the same interrogation, the same chemical extraction, the same disposal protocols that awaited Paul. "Listen carefully," Paul said, making a decision that would either save them both or accelerate their deaths. "I'm planning to escape during my transfer. If I can reach civilian authorities, expose what we witnessed, maybe we can stop this before they kill everyone who was at Nevada." Thompson's eyes widened with desperate hope, mixed with realistic terror. "Sir, they're watching everything, monitoring communications, tracking movements, probably listening to this conversation through surveillance equipment." Paul nodded, having discovered the recording devices in his quarters, but he'd also noticed something the watchers might have missed: a maintenance tunnel system beneath Fort Ord that connected to civilian infrastructure outside the base perimeter. If he could access those tunnels during transfer, evade pursuit long enough to reach a payphone, contact journalists or FBI agents who might investigate rather than cover up. "Tomorrow night, I'm going to drive toward Monterey as planned," Paul explained quietly, "but I'll take the back route through Salinas, try to reach the sheriff's department before they catch me. If I don't make it, if they kill me during the attempt, promise you'll try to contact my brother Carl in Pittsburgh. Tell him everything about Nevada, about the foreign researchers, about the elimination program." Thompson nodded solemnly, understanding that he was probably receiving final instructions from a dead man. "What about the other Nevada veterans? Rodriguez, Williams, Chen, they're all showing symptoms. They'll be processed through the same elimination procedures." Paul felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on his deteriorating body. Escape would only save himself, leaving the others to face torture and death alone. But staying meant certain elimination for everyone, while flight offered at least the possibility of exposing the conspiracy before more soldiers died. If I can get the story out, maybe I can save them too. But if I don't try, we're all dead anyway. As they parted company, Paul caught sight of surveillance personnel adjusting their positions to maintain visual contact. The hunting party was tightening their perimeter, preparing for his final, desperate move. 71 hours remained until official transfer, but Paul planned to make his break in less than 24. The race between salvation and elimination was about to begin. July 10th, 1600 hours. Paul Whipkey gripped the steering wheel of his red Chevrolet convertible with fingers that left bloody smears on the leather, his loosening fingernails unable to maintain proper grip. The taste of iron flooded his mouth as another tooth shifted in its socket, his body continuing its radioactive decay, even as he attempted his desperate escape from Fort Ord. 2 surveillance vehicles maintained their positions behind him as he drove toward what everyone believed would be his final drink in Monterey. But Paul had no intention of reaching that destination. Hidden beneath his passenger seat lay civilian clothes, forged identification documents he'd stolen from base administration, and enough cash to purchase a bus ticket to San Francisco, where he hoped to contact investigative journalists. The plan seemed pathetically inadequate against professional killers, but it represented his only alternative to chemical interrogation and disposal in an unmarked grave. 5 miles from the base, Paul's engine began stuttering. The accelerator responded sluggishly as his speed dropped from 50 miles per hour to 30, then 20. White smoke poured from beneath the hood, clear evidence of sabotage designed to strand him at a predetermined location where elimination could proceed without civilian witnesses. His Chevrolet coasted to a stop beside Murphy's Last Chance Diner, its neon sign flickering against the approaching dusk. Through the restaurant windows, Paul could see truckers and traveling salesmen eating dinner, completely unaware that an execution was about to unfold in their parking lot. 4 men emerged from the pursuing vehicles, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training in asset termination. They wore civilian clothing, but carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing. Contractors, mercenaries, or special operations personnel assigned to clean up biological weapons secrets. Paul considered running toward the diner, screaming for help, trying to create enough commotion to prevent a quiet elimination. But he recognized the futility of resistance against professionals who specialized in making inconvenient soldiers disappear without trace evidence. The team leader approached Paul's window with practiced casualness, his hand resting near a concealed weapon. He possessed the same forgettable features as the Building 47 interrogators, designed by nature or training to blend into crowds and disappear from witness memory. Lieutenant Whipkey, time to come with us. Your transfer orders have been expedited due to medical concerns about your deteriorating condition. I want to speak with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Paul said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. That won't be necessary. Your medical treatment requires immediate attention at a specialized facility equipped to handle radiation exposure cases. Paul understood the euphemism. They would transport him to a black site medical facility where foreign researchers could complete their biological weapons studies using his dying body as experimental material. The data collected from his systematic torture would inform future attacks against American forces. As hands reached through the window to extract him from the vehicle, Paul noticed something that sent his terror into overdrive. The team leader wore latex gloves that suggested he expected to handle contaminated biological material. Paul's irradiated blood, tissue samples, organs that would be harvested during the elimination process. They weren't just planning to kill him. They intended to dissect him while he remained conscious, collecting scientific data about radiation effects on human physiology until his heart finally stopped beating. Paul's last coherent thought before the chloroform-soaked cloth covered his nose was a prayer that Thompson would remember his promise to contact Carl, and that someone, somewhere, would eventually expose the nightmare that had consumed the Nevada veterans. The darkness that enveloped Lieutenant Paul Byron Whipkey wasn't sleep. It was the beginning of his final contribution to biological weapons research conducted by America's enemies, using America's own soldiers as unwilling test subjects. Paul regained consciousness, strapped to a surgical table in a sterile chamber that reeked of disinfectant and human fear. Overhead fluorescent lights blazed with operating room intensity, illuminating medical equipment that belonged in a torture facility rather than a healing institution. 4 tubes snaked into his arms, delivering chemicals that kept him conscious but paralyzed, aware of every procedure but unable to resist. The foreign technician from Building 47 stood beside monitoring equipment that recorded Paul's vital signs, brain activity, and stress responses. This wasn't interrogation anymore. It was live vivisection designed to extract both information and biological data from his irradiated body. "Lieutenant Whipkey, you're participating in groundbreaking research," the technician explained, with clinical detachment. "Your radiation exposure provides unique opportunities to study cellular breakdown patterns that will inform future biological weapons development." Paul tried to speak, but discovered his vocal cords had been chemically paralyzed. He could only watch in horror as the technician prepared instruments for tissue extraction, bone marrow sampling, and neurological probing that would map his brain's knowledge storage while simultaneously destroying it. The sodium pentothal will ensure complete memory recovery. Every detail about Nevada operations, every witness you encountered, every security breach you observed, all will be documented before we harvest your organs for contamination analysis. Through the observation window, Paul glimpsed other tables occupied by figures he recognized with dawning terror. Private Rodriguez lay motionless while technicians extracted spinal fluid, his eyes wide with conscious agony. Sergeant Williams endured bone-drilling procedures that collected radioactive marrow samples. Corporal Chen's skull had been opened, electrodes inserted directly into brain tissue to map memory engrams before extraction. They were systematically processing every Nevada veteran through live experimentation, collecting scientific data that would perfect biological weapons designed to kill American soldiers in future conflicts. The atomic testing program had been an elaborate cover for collaborative genocide, with foreign researchers using U.S. military personnel as unwitting test subjects. Paul's interrogation began with chemical injections that stripped away his mental defenses like acid-dissolving metal. Under pharmaceutical influence, he found himself describing every classified detail he'd witnessed: the unauthorized sampling equipment, the foreign personnel, the tissue collection procedures, the security breaches that had exposed American nuclear secrets to hostile intelligence services. "Excellent cooperation, Lieutenant. Now we'll begin the physical sampling phase." The first incision opened his abdomen without anesthesia, allowing Paul to experience every moment of agony as contaminated organs were removed for analysis. His liver, kidneys, and portions of his intestinal tract disappeared into refrigerated containers marked with foreign symbols, destined for laboratories where enemy researchers would study American radiation exposure patterns. Between organ extractions, the technician continued his psychological probing, using electrical stimulation to force Paul's brain to relive Nevada memories in excruciating detail. Every observation, every security lapse, every moment of forbidden knowledge was recorded for future intelligence exploitation. Your sacrifice advances scientific understanding of how radiation affects military personnel, the technician observed as he prepared to extract Paul's heart. This data will help our allies develop more effective biological weapons for use against your country's forces. Paul's final conscious thought was a desperate hope that Thompson had escaped, that someone would eventually expose this nightmare, that his death might somehow prevent other soldiers from suffering similar fates. But as darkness closed around his vision, Paul realized with crystalline horror that this facility probably processed dozens of American military personnel every month, each one contributing to biological weapons research that would kill thousands of their fellow soldiers in conflicts yet to come. The program would continue long after Lieutenant Paul Byron Whipkey became nothing more than tissue samples in enemy laboratories and data points in classified reports. At 0600 hours on July 11th, 2 enlisted men arrived at Lieutenant Paul Whipkey's quarters with packing materials and shipping labels. They worked with practiced efficiency, systematically removing every photograph, letter, uniform, and personal document that proved Paul Byron Whipkey had ever existed at Fort Ord. Within 90 minutes, the room looked as sterile as a hospital ward awaiting its next patient. When Sergeant Martinez questioned the unusual activity, he was informed that Lieutenant Whipkey had been reassigned to classified duties, requiring immediate quarters preparation. The explanation satisfied military protocol while concealing the truth. Paul's identity was being erased with the same thoroughness as his physical elimination. Private Thompson watched the erasure process from his barracks window, understanding that he was witnessing his own future. The systematic destruction of Paul's existence served as preview of what awaited every Nevada veteran who'd witnessed unauthorized biological weapons research. Within hours, official records would show that Lieutenant Paul Byron Whipkey had never served at Fort Ord, never participated in atomic testing, never posed any threat to national security. But Thompson had made a promise to a dying man, and despite the surveillance equipment monitoring his every movement, he managed to place one final phone call from a payphone outside the base commissary. Carl Whipkey answered on the third ring, his voice heavy with sleep and confusion about receiving a call from an unknown soldier at such an early hour. "Sir, your brother Paul asked me to contact you if something happened to him," Thompson whispered into the receiver, constantly scanning for surveillance personnel. "He's gone, sir. They took him yesterday evening. But before they eliminated him, he wanted you to know about Nevada, about the foreign researchers, about what they're doing to American soldiers." Thompson provided every detail he could remember: the biological sampling equipment, the tissue collection procedures, the elimination program targeting atomic testing veterans. He spoke rapidly, knowing the call would be traced and terminated within minutes. "They're killing us all, sir. Everyone who was at Camp Desert Rock, making us disappear so nobody can expose the biological weapons collaboration. Paul said you should contact journalists, FBI agents, anyone who might investigate instead of covering up." The line went dead before Carl could respond, but Thompson had fulfilled his final obligation to Lieutenant Paul Byron Whipkey. 5 days later, Thompson failed to report for morning formation. His body was discovered near the base perimeter, apparently the victim of a training accident involving heavy equipment. No witnesses came forward. No operator accepted responsibility. The incident report classified his death as misadventure during routine operations. By month's end, all surviving Nevada veterans had suffered similar fates: traffic accidents, equipment malfunctions, sudden medical emergencies that required immediate transfer to facilities where they vanished without trace. The biological weapons program had successfully eliminated every witness to its collaboration with foreign researchers. Carl Whipkey spent 19 years fighting the military bureaucracy for answers about his brother's disappearance, never knowing that Paul's final moments had been spent as a conscious laboratory specimen contributing data to America's enemies. The truth died with Lieutenant Paul Byron Whipkey in that sterile chamber, along with dozens of other soldiers whose sacrifice advanced biological weapons designed to kill their own countrymen. Today, similar programs continue in facilities that don't appear on any maps, processing military personnel who've witnessed classified operations that threaten operational security. The names change, locations shift, but the fundamental equation remains constant. Soldiers who know too much become experimental subjects whose deaths serve enemy interests. The War Maestro's archive remembers them all, these forgotten casualties of institutional betrayal who paid the ultimate price for serving a country that consumed its own defenders to protect its darkest secrets. If Lieutenant Whipkey's final transmission has reached you through the static, you're ready to join the War Maestro's classified briefing list. Check your medical records, make sure no pages are missing, then subscribe to Decrypt More Buried Military Nightmares. Hit that notification bell because some secrets surface without warning, and you'll want to be present when the next file declassifies. Remember, some soldiers never made it home from Nevada, but their stories refuse to stay buried.